I want to do a really brief video. You've probably never had conversations like this with white people. By the way, I identify as a white person. Some people consider me non-white because I'm Jewish. Depends on where you're living. In the south of France, I was considered non-white, but in New York City, I'd be considered white. Anyway, I've had a lot of conversations with white people about First Nations languages because I formerly was a student learning Cree and Ojibwe, and basically all my life I've cared a lot about First Nations politics, First Nations languages, by which I mean Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Saulteaux, Mohawk, etc., the native peoples of Canada. Not everyone knows that term, First Nations. When you talk to white people about it, some of them get defensive, and some of them say this in a detached way. You hear their excuses for why they personally have never studied an Indigenous language, have never studied one of these languages, why they would never study them, why they're not teaching their kids these languages. And sometimes it's stated in terms of why they don't think these languages should be taught in schools, why they basically think nobody should study these languages. I mean, they will never state it that bluntly, but it's often stated in terms of why they wouldn't do it and why others shouldn't do it. And I mean, that's interesting. Like, that is already interesting. People should examine what their motivations are for having those conversations with me. If I told people I was studying ancient Greek, I don't think I'd get a similar reaction like, yeah, well, this is why I'd never study ancient Greek. You know, obviously they emotionally feel there's something they have to explain to themselves. Like, they were born and raised in Canada, they've lived their whole lives in Canada, and you see and feel this shadow of genocide on you, this shadow of the colonial history of why Canada is the way it is, why Toronto is called Toronto, why Ottawa is called Ottawa. You know, like, these are native place names on the map. Why Saskatchewan is called Saskatchewan. You know it, right? To some extent, you know it's there, and yet you never even read a Wikipedia article on it. Most of the time, I'm talking to people who've never even done like Wikipedia level reading about who are the Cree, who are the Ojibwe. They've really lived in self-selected ignorance. And I think that's why they react that way. Now, sorry, I've studied a lot of languages. And at one point, I was actually studying modern Greek, not ancient Greek, but they're very similar, modern Greek. So I told you, yeah, I'm learning Greek, you know. And I got those reactions that obviously for several years I was studying Cambodian in several different circumstances. Nobody ever had this reaction like, oh, well, I don't know, I wouldn't support Cambodian being taught in the schools, or like I'd never study Cambodian myself. Like, you know, there was no sense of that. But even for white people, of course, I've talked about this with First Nations people too, and their reactions are really meaningful and interesting. That'd be a separate video. But this obviously stirs something in the white Canadian ego. And, you know, in a sense it should. Canada should be in a position to be proud of its Indigenous languages and proud of its Indigenous heritage instead of being ashamed of it. Like, in a really simple sense, you know, I remember the last time I was in Ottawa, the last two times, they had this fabulous exhibition on of Inuit statuary, Inuit stone sculptures. It was fabulous. And I remember looking at it, and, you know, there really is this sense of like, well, this is the great Canadian art. This really represents Canada. Now, it's not only the Inuit. We also have a lot of really good West Coast BC Indigenous carvers. If you go, have you been to Vancouver Airport? Okay.
No.
Okay. Vancouver Airport has gorgeous, like, large-scale statues and art by First Nations people. There is this sense in which Canada, even the name Canada is a First Nations word, in case you hadn't guessed. Canada isn't a small town in England or something, you know? It's not like New York. It's not New Canada. This is the first Canada. It's the only one. It's not like New York. It's not like New England. This is old Canada. This is the original Canada. It's the only one we got. There is this ineluctable sense in which First Nations statuary, whether it's West Coast or Inuit or something, represents Canada, and Canada is tied to it, and that's never going to change. No matter how badly we manage to fuck this up, no matter how close we come to outright genocide or the disappearance of these languages, it always has that gravitas. It always has that significance in Canada. It always will. And a lot of white people feel we ought to be able to be proud of this, but instead we don't feel pride. It's not part of a positive pan-Canadian nationalism. Instead, it's this subject of shame and excuse-making and awkward rationalizations. Across the political spectrum, left-wing, right-wing, moderate, in between, whatever, you know, I find this. So in terms of the actual excuses people give me for these languages, it's interesting. The number one excuse, and I think this is actually imitating Australians, because Australians will tell you this about native Australian. I think they're taught this in school. This is like the standard excuse in Australia is, well, there are so many native languages, like we can't possibly learn them all, right? And guys like, well, there are so many Asian languages. You can't learn. Why learn Cambodian when there are hundreds of others? You know what I mean? Even within Cambodia, there are several languages. Within Laos, we have like more than 40 languages. Within Southeast Asia, we have a lot of languages. So, therefore, what would be the significance of learning any one language? Now, that is very obviously a rationalization. It's very obviously nonsensical. Like, well, the fact that I can't learn Inuit also makes it meaningless for me to learn Cree, right? So with those people, again, I really find they just need to read Wikipedia. They often have the misconception that somehow each of these languages is very, very localized, that it can't, like you'd learn a language and it would only be valid in one village or something. And I just say to them, well, can you look at this Wikipedia article? Can you actually see the map of how much land Cree covers as a language? And yes, you can get into specific dialects within Cree, but believe me, if you speak West Cree, you can learn East. Their dialects are the same language. They are fundamentally the same language. I mean, it can be hard even within England. If you meet someone who really speaks British English with a Welsh accent, and then you go to southeast London, there are dialect differences within the United Kingdom, within England, but but still, it's one language, and still, whether you're looking at the contrast between Swampy Cree and Rocky Cree, or even, within Ojibwe, Soto and Oji Cree, yes, there are differences, but these are actually languages that now cover a huge amount of territory. And this centralization and rationalization of those languages has already happened. We already have a modern standard form of written Cree, modern standard written Ojibwe. That process is over. So a lot of people offering this critique or excuse, they're assuming that's something that hasn't happened yet. Like that the First Nations languages aren't ready for the word processor and for the computer. It's like, no, actually, all that happened a long time ago for a bunch of different reasons, but including the Christian missionaries. Because there were Christian missionaries who were really motivated to get the Bible written in a standard Cree, standard Ojibwe, what have you. And, yes, there is more than one standard. But again, if you actually, there's more than one standard for German. Like, yes, there's Swiss German and there's Austrian German and there's Northern German. Like, so what? Does that make it harder to learn any one form of German? No. Is it really that hard to understand Swiss German if your background is in Austrian German? No. So it's an excuse-making mentality, and all those people, I just find they're kind of one Wikipedia article away from dropping that, or just looking at that map and realizing, oh, wow, Cree is a unique opportunity for a really pan-Canadian First Nations language that's powerful and useful, what have you. Ojibwe, the opportunity is a little bit different because it's more in the United States than it is in Canada. We have a lot of Ojibwe in Canada, don't get me wrong. But if you look at how they're distributed, a lot of the Ojibwe homeland is south of the Great Lakes and thus is now in the United States. But Ojibwe is also a great opportunity. And again, it's already been standardized. There already are dictionaries and one spelling system and what have you, covering a huge area. So this isn't a case of a language that's only said in one village. So, what's most interesting to me here are not the excuses, but the underlying motivations for those excuses. Why is it that nobody in Ottawa speaks the Ottawa language? Why is it there are no street signs? And if you've ever been to Ottawa, they put in these enormous efforts to have French everywhere, to make everything bilingual, to make sure there's French and English, but there's no effort to make the Ottawa language, written anywhere. Now, Ottawa is very similar to Cree. Ottawa is in the Algonquin language family. Those are all very, very similar languages. Cree, Ojibwe, Ottawa, there are others. And the Ottawa language specifically, it seems completely inevitable that it's going to go extinct, So probably the opportunity in the future will be either to have Ojibwe or Cree written in the city of Ottawa and not specifically the Ottawa language. And that's very sad. But again, New York was the homeland of the Lenape. Lenape was a very important language, same language family, Algonquin language. And the opportunity to preserve Lenape as a language is now already gone. That's already extinct. I've seen estimates that there are like 20 people who can still speak Ottawa, but some of them say that's a few years out of date. It's probably the last 5 people or something. On this one reservation that's in the U.S., there are maybe a couple people who can still really speak Ottawa. But Ottawa is really facing extinction, and the opportunities there to promote and promulgate and expand Cree and Ojibwe. Now this is happening tragically in the context of genocide and colonialism. However, it is also true that, for example, within the history of Europe, you did have the emergence of, Standard German from a plurality of German dialects. You have the emergence of Standard English from a plurality of English dialects. And, the specific story of Boswell and Johnson and the writing of the first popular dictionaries in English. And then many centuries later, the emergence of radio and television. There's a lot to that story of how did Standard English emerge. Yes, it is ultimately tragic that Standard Cree and Ojibwe have emerged in the way that they have. But now, in 2017, they have emerged. And we could say something similar about Mohawk specifically. And the question is, do we take the next step, or do we keep making excuses and lying to ourselves about our own insecurities as white Canadians until these languages go extinct? Look, bring us back to, I like to keep it real. I like to keep it all the way real.
That's right.
Girlfriend's having a little cough. It's okay. I like to keep it all the way real. So we know a white Canadian who put her daughters into a Chinese language school in Canada. Mm-hmm. So why is this? Obviously, there are white Canadians who are proud to have their white kids grow up speaking Chinese. The Chinese language has some kind of prestige for them. By the way, I speak Chinese. I'm living in China right now as I make this video. You may not know this if you're watching this video for some other reason. So I'm not prejudiced against the Chinese as a people or Chinese as a language. Okay? There are other people, obviously, who put their kids into Jewish schools where they grow up speaking Hebrew, where there's this big cultural emphasis on learning Hebrew as a prestige language, right? And, there are some Christians who do that also because they feel Hebrew is the basis of the Christian tradition, but obviously more common with Judaism, right? By the way, ethnically, I'm half Jewish, so obviously I'm not saying this out of anti-Semitism, okay? But the question has to be asked, will there ever be a time when white Canadians are proud to have their kids grow up speaking Ojibwe, Mohawk, Cree, Dene, Inuit, Inuktitut, you name it? Are we moving towards that or not? Is there going to be one school in downtown Ottawa that instead of being the English-Chinese bilingual school or the English-French bilingual school really is the English-Cree or English-Ojibwe bilingual school, and where it's not something people are ashamed of and that's second rate, or is a concession because of a reconciliation process, where it's a prestige school, people say, yes, I'm Canadian, I'm part of the history of Canada, I'm part of the political future of Canada, and therefore I'm putting in the time and effort and money to make sure my kid grows up with some level of language ability in Cree or Ojibwe. That means something more than raising my kids speaking French. By the way, my own daughter speaks French fluently. A lot of my family relatives speak French, blah, blah, blah. French is also part of my family. It's not that I'm anti-French, but I am. Anyway, sorry, I've lived in France. My opinion about living in France would be another video, but yeah. French has this status of a prestige language. Chinese does, et cetera, et cetera. We need to really re-examine those attitudes for the future, and we have to recognize Canada is never going to be New England. Canada is never going to be New France. This is something of really fundamental importance, and it's a positive opportunity for a future. Either we take advantage of it now or never. Hold the mic.
Yeah.